Donald Trump has faced lawsuits before. He has faced investigations before. He has faced judges, prosecutors, appeals courts, and the Supreme Court before. But what happened this week has once again put Trump's legal battles directly under the spotlight. On August 17th, the United States Supreme Court delivered another setback to Trump when the justices refused to reconsider his appeal in the E. Carroll case. Before we proceed, please take a few seconds of your time and click the subscribe button to subscribe to our channel for free premium news. The decision leaves a $5 million civil judgment against Trump intact. And this is important because this was not simply another lower court ruling. Trump had already gone all the way to the nation's highest court, and the Supreme Court had already rejected his appeal once. His legal team asked the justices to reconsider. The court said no, again. But here's where this story gets much bigger, because the $5 million case is only one part of Trump's growing legal landscape. There is another Carroll judgment worth $83.3 million that is still in the picture. There are new lawsuits challenging Trump's tariffs. 25 states have taken the administration to court over its latest tariffs. The administration is also fighting over Trump's proposed $400 million White House ballroom project. And across the country, dozens upon dozens of cases continue to challenge actions taken by the Trump administration. So the question today is not simply, did Trump lose another appeal? The bigger question is, what happens next? What legal battles are still alive? Which cases could become more serious? Could Trump win some of these fights? And how much authority does the Supreme Court actually have to stop or reshape what his administration is doing? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll have a much clearer picture of Trump's legal battles and why the latest Supreme Court decision may be only one chapter of a much larger story. Let's start with the decision that has everyone talking. On Monday, August 17th, the Supreme Court once again refused to hear Donald Trump's challenge to the $5 million verdict involving writer E. Jean Carroll. The underlying 2023 jury verdict found Trump liable for sexually abusing Carroll and defaming her. Importantly, this was a civil case, not a criminal conviction. That distinction matters. The jury did not find Trump criminally guilty. Instead, it found him civilly liable and awarded Carroll damages. Trump challenged the verdict through the appeals process. Eventually, his legal team brought the matter to the Supreme Court. But in June, the justices declined to hear the appeal. Trump then asked the court to reconsider, and now the court has rejected that request as well. Reuters reports that the Supreme Court's latest order was unsigned and did not provide an explanation, which is normal for this type of decision. For Trump, this means another avenue of appeal has effectively closed in this particular case, and that is why the headline is so significant. This wasn't a lower-level court saying no. This wasn't simply a procedural delay. The highest court in the United States declined to intervene. Again, according to Reuters, Carroll has already collected approximately $5.63 million from Trump, including interest. So when people ask, what does the Supreme Court decision actually change? The answer is straightforward. It leaves the existing judgment standing. But there is another important part of this story, and this is where things get even more interesting. Many people may hear about the $5 million judgment and assume that Trump's entire legal battle with E. Jean Carroll is now finished. That's not quite accurate. There is another separate case. In that case, a jury awarded Carroll $83.3 million for defamation stemming from Trump's statements about her in 2019. Trump has appealed that judgment, and the Supreme Court is still considering whether to hear that appeal. So we now have two different legal situations. One, the Supreme Court has refused to reconsider Trump's appeal concerning the $5 million judgment. Two, the separate $83.3 million judgment remains pending before the Supreme Court. That distinction is extremely important. It would be inaccurate to say that the Supreme Court has already rejected Trump's appeal in the $83.3 million case. It hasn't, at least not as of the latest reporting. The court is still considering that separate matter, and that means there could be another major development ahead. Trump's lawyers have also raised presidential immunity arguments in connection with the $83.3 million case. That raises a complicated legal question. How far does presidential immunity extend when statements made by a president are alleged to have caused civil liability? The Supreme Court's 2024 decision concerning presidential immunity dealt with criminal prosecution for official presidential acts. But the Carroll cases are civil matters, so the legal questions are not identical. And this is exactly why the second case could become extremely important. Because if the Supreme Court decides to take it, the justices could be forced to examine another major question involving presidential power and civil liability. Now let's zoom out, because if you only focus on the Carroll case, you are missing the bigger picture. Trump's administration is facing legal challenges on multiple fronts. One of the most significant involves tariffs, and this one could have consequences far beyond Trump personally. Earlier this month, 25 states sued the Trump administration over its latest tariffs. Reuters reported that the states argued Trump's new tariffs were unlawful and challenged the administration's attempt to impose them. This is a major legal fight. Why? Because tariffs affect far more than lawyers and politicians. They can affect businesses, they can affect importers, they can affect consumers, and they can affect the relationship between the federal government and the states. The states are essentially asking the courts to determine whether the administration has the legal authority to impose these tariffs in the way it has. And this lawsuit is particularly interesting because it comes after an earlier Supreme Court ruling concerning Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs. That means this isn't happening in a legal vacuum. There is already a significant judicial history surrounding Trump's tariff strategy. And now the administration is trying to navigate a new round of litigation. The 25-state lawsuit is therefore one of the legal battles that deserves very close attention. Because if courts restrict the administration's ability to impose certain tariffs, the consequences could extend beyond one lawsuit. It could affect how the administration uses executive authority in future economic policies. Let's make this simple. Imagine the president wants to impose a major economic policy using executive authority. The administration says, "We have the legal authority to do this." Opponents respond, "No, you have exceeded the authority Congress gave you." The courts then have to decide, and that is where the constitutional structure of the United States becomes important. The American system divides government power among Congress, the president, and the courts. The president has significant executive authority, but that authority is not unlimited. Congress makes federal laws. The executive branch enforces them, and the courts determine what the law means and whether government action violates the Constitution or exceeds statutory authority. That is why Trump's legal battles are bigger than Trump himself. These cases can establish precedents that affect future presidents. If a court says a president has a particular power, future presidents may attempt to use that same power. If a court says the president does not have that authority, future administrations may be restricted as well. So when we talk about Trump's lawsuits, we're not simply talking about political drama. We're talking about questions of presidential power. And then there is another extraordinary legal fight. The Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to allow construction of a proposed $400 million White House ballroom project to proceed. The project has already become the subject of legal challenges. A lower court previously paused above-ground construction while the administration appealed. The administration has argued that the president has authority to proceed with the project and that portions of the project involve national security considerations. Opponents argue that the administration has not followed required legal procedures, including congressional authorization. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has also asked the Supreme Court to intervene. Think about what is happening here. The President of the United States is not simply fighting one lawsuit. His administration is simultaneously defending executive actions involving trade, immigration, government institutions, presidential authority, media organizations, federal agencies, and even physical changes to the White House complex. That is an enormous legal footprint, and the Supreme Court is increasingly being asked to decide where the boundaries of presidential authority actually lie. Another developing legal fight involves the Trump administration's executive orders targeting law firms. On August 18th, Reuters reported that the Justice Department invoked executive privilege in a lawsuit involving the American Bar Association and administration policies affecting law firms. The dispute concerns claims that the administration unlawfully targeted law firms because of their legal work, diversity initiatives, hiring practices, or political affiliations. The administration disputes those allegations. Several law firms have already successfully challenged Trump's executive orders in court, while others have reached settlements. And now the government is defending its position on the executive privilege. This is another case where the legal issue is larger than one administration. It raises questions about how far a president can go in using executive power against private institutions. And once again, the courts have become the arena where those questions are being fought. Immigration policy is another major battlefield. Just this week, a federal appeals court upheld a preliminary injunction limiting immigration enforcement actions at 8 houses of worship associated with Quaker, Sikh, and Cooperative Baptist Fellowship groups. Reuters reports that the court found that the administration's policy likely violated the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the circumstances presented by the plaintiffs. But notice something important. This ruling does not mean that all immigration enforcement near all places of worship across America has been permanently prohibited. The ruling applies to the specific plaintiff-affiliated sites involved in that litigation. That distinction matters. Political commentary often turns complicated court orders into simple headlines, but the actual legal consequences can be much narrower. And that is why viewers should pay attention to what the courts actually order, not merely what politicians or commentators claim the ruling means. Now let's take another step back. According to Lawfare's Trump administration litigation tracker, hundreds of active cases are challenging actions taken by the Trump administration. Its August 10th update listed 333 active cases challenging Trump administration actions, along with numerous cases involving the administration challenging state or local laws and multiple Supreme Court interventions. That number alone tells you something. The legal battles are not isolated. They form a massive network of litigation. Some cases concern immigration, some concern tariffs, some concern executive orders, some concern federal agencies, some concern civil rights, some concern government funding, some concern presidential authority, and some concern Trump's own personal legal liabilities. So when you hear Trump is facing lawsuits, that phrase is actually describing an enormous range of completely different legal disputes. Some will be dismissed, some will be settled, some will be appealed, some will succeed, some will fail, and some may eventually reach the Supreme Court. There is another side to this story. Trump does not lose every legal battle, and it would be misleading to suggest that every lawsuit against his administration is succeeding. In fact, the administration has also won important legal battles. That's why the real story is more complicated. Trump's administration has repeatedly asked courts to block lower court decisions, has won dismissals in some cases, and has successfully defended certain policies. The legal picture is therefore not Trump loses everything. It is much more accurately described as Trump's administration is engaged in an enormous legal battle across multiple fronts, with wins and losses occurring in different courts. That distinction is essential, because if your channel wants credibility, you don't want to tell viewers that every ruling is a catastrophe. You want to explain what happened, then explain what it means, then explain what could happen next. That is how you build an audience that comes back. So let's return to the biggest question. What happens next? First, everyone will be watching the Supreme Court's handling of the separate $83.3 million Carroll case. The court has not yet rejected that appeal. If the justices decline to hear it, the existing judgment would remain in place. If the court agrees to hear the case, however, the legal battle would enter a much more significant stage. And that is why this case deserves attention. Trump's lawyers are not simply asking for more time. They are raising legal questions about presidential immunity and civil liability. The Supreme Court could eventually decide whether those arguments justify further review. But until the court actually acts, we should not assume what it will do. That is an important distinction. Then there's the tariff litigation. 25 states have already sued the administration over its latest tariffs. The courts now have to work through the legal arguments. If the states succeed, the administration could face restrictions on how it implements the challenged tariffs. If the administration prevails, Trump's tariff strategy could receive another legal boost, and depending on the rulings, the dispute could eventually return to the Supreme Court. This is one of the cases that could have economic consequences as well as constitutional consequences. Because the question is not simply, should tariffs exist? The legal question is, does the president have the authority to impose these particular tariffs using this particular legal mechanism? Those are two very different questions. And this brings us to the Supreme Court. The court is not supposed to function as Trump's political opponent. It is not supposed to function as his political ally either. Its role is to interpret the Constitution and federal law. That means Trump can win cases, Trump can lose cases, and sometimes the court can issue decisions that benefit one part of his agenda while restricting another. That's exactly why we should be careful with political headlines. When the Supreme Court rejects an appeal, it does not necessarily mean the justices have ruled against every legal argument Trump has ever made. Sometimes the court simply decides not to hear a particular case. That is essentially what happened with the latest Carroll decision. The court rejected Trump's request for reconsideration. The order did not provide a detailed explanation. So the proper takeaway is, Trump's attempt to reopen this particular appeal has failed. Not, the Supreme Court has declared everything Trump does illegal. Those are completely different statements. Could Trump's legal problems get worse? Absolutely. But that does not mean every case will end against him. The reason the situation could become more difficult is that multiple cases are progressing simultaneously. One case may involve money, another may involve executive authority, another may involve immigration, another may involve tariffs, another may involve the White House, another may involve the media, and another may involve presidential immunity. When many cases move at once, the administration has to defend its policies on multiple legal fronts, and every court ruling can potentially influence the next battle. A ruling in one case can become a precedent. An appellate decision can change the legal strategy. A Supreme Court decision can establish a rule that affects numerous future cases. That is why the next few months could be particularly important. At the heart of many of these lawsuits is one fundamental question. How much power does a president actually have? Trump has pursued an aggressive vision of executive authority. His administration has used executive orders, emergency powers, and administrative actions to pursue major policy changes. Supporters argue that the president needs strong authority to act quickly. Critics argue that executive power has limits and that Congress and the courts must enforce those limits. And that debate is now being fought in courtrooms across America. The outcome will not only affect Donald Trump, it could affect future presidents. Imagine a future president of a completely different political party. If the courts establish that a president has broad authority to do something, that precedent could potentially be used by the next administration. That's why constitutional lawyers and legal scholars are watching these cases so closely. The legal battle surrounding Trump is also a battle over the future interpretation of presidential power. There is another category of litigation that deserves attention: Trump's battles with media organizations. Axios reported this week that lawsuits involving Trump, his businesses, and his administration against media and defamation targets have increased significantly. According to Axios's analysis, there have been 61 such legal cases involving Trump and related entities since 2015, including 16 in 2025 and 9 already in 2026. The administration argues that it is fighting what it considers politically motivated misinformation. Media organizations and press freedom groups argue that some of these actions threaten journalism and the First Amendment. Again, these disputes are being fought through the legal system, and many of them could take years to resolve. That means Trump's legal story isn't simply about what happens this week. Some of these cases may still be in court long after the headlines have disappeared. So what should you watch for from here? Here are 5 things. Number 1, the $83.3 million Carroll case. The Supreme Court's decision about whether to hear Trump's appeal could become another major legal headline. Number 2, the 25-state tariff lawsuit. Watch what the lower courts do and whether the administration appeals. Number 3, the White House ballroom case. The Supreme Court has been asked to intervene, making this another important test of presidential authority. Number 4, executive power cases. Watch lawsuits challenging Trump's executive orders and federal policies. Number 5, The overall litigation picture. Individual lawsuits may look unrelated, but together they reveal an enormous constitutional and administrative law debate over the power of the presidency. Now let's talk about the political dimension. A legal setback does not automatically translate into a political setback. Trump has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to survive political and legal controversy. His supporters often see these lawsuits as evidence that political opponents and institutions are trying to obstruct his agenda. His critics often see the same lawsuits as necessary checks on presidential power. And that means every major court decision is likely to be interpreted through a political lens. But the courts operate differently. A judge isn't supposed to ask, will this help Trump? The legal question is, what does the Constitution and the law require? That distinction is extremely important, and it is one reason why the next series of court rulings could be so consequential. So, is Trump's legal nightmare getting worse? That depends on what you mean by nightmare. If you mean that Trump is facing a growing number of legal challenges across multiple areas of government policy, then yes, there is no question that the administration is dealing with extensive litigation. If you mean that Trump is losing every case, absolutely not. He isn't. There are victories, defeats, appeals, settlements, and cases that remain unresolved. And if you mean that the latest Supreme Court decision ends Trump's legal problems, definitely not. The court's rejection concerns a specific $5 million Carroll judgment. The separate $83.3 million Carroll case remains pending. The tariff litigation continues. The White House ballroom fight continues. The law firm litigation continues. Immigration-related cases continue. And hundreds of other cases challenging administration actions remain active. So the real story is not that Trump has suddenly lost everything. The real story is that the legal battle surrounding his presidency remains enormous. The next phase may be even more important than the latest decision. Because now the question is no longer simply, can Trump appeal? The question becomes, which cases will survive long enough to reach the next level? Some lawsuits will disappear, some will be dismissed, some will be settled, some will produce injunctions, some will be overturned on appeal, and a small number could eventually reach the Supreme Court. That process could take months or even years. But the decisions being made now could establish legal precedents that last much longer than Trump's current term. And that is what makes these cases so important. So here's the big question. Is Donald Trump entering one of the most consequential legal battles of his presidency? Or will his administration continue to win enough cases to push its agenda forward? Right now, the answer is still being written. The Supreme Court has just refused to reopen Trump's $5 million Carroll appeal. That judgment remains intact. The separate $83.3 million Carroll case remains pending. 25 states are challenging Trump's latest tariffs. The administration is fighting over the White House ballroom project, and numerous other lawsuits are challenging actions taken by the Trump administration. At the same time, Trump's lawyers continue to defend the administration aggressively, and they have also won important legal battles. So don't expect this story to end with one Supreme Court order. It won't. The legal battles are continuing, and the next major ruling could come from a district court, it could come from an appeals court, or it could eventually come from the Supreme Court itself. And when that happens, we'll be watching. What do you think? Does the latest Supreme Court decision represent a serious legal setback for Donald Trump? Or is this simply one case in a much larger legal battle that could still go either way? And what do you think the Supreme Court will do with the separate $83.3 million Carroll appeal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to stay updated on the biggest developments involving Donald Trump, the Supreme Court, Congress, and the legal battles shaping American politics, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this story is far from over. The next ruling could change the conversation again, and when it happens, we'll break it down. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.